You know, for a little while, it was mostly a radical Republican Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was comparing things to the Holocaust, equating things to the Nazis, raising other comparisons to World War II. It's now just becoming very widespread on the American right, and it has a lot to do with vaccines. We're going to look at a few clips. Here is David Brody, who used to be a regular panelist on Meet the Press. He was on his show. I guess he has a show now, Water Cooler on Real America's Voice. I don't know. I don't even know what that means. He is again talking about Nazis and Nuremberg codes when it comes to vaccination. Take a listen.
Violation of federal law. So why? Well, because it would violate a little thing called the Nuremberg Code, a code mentioned on the FDA website, not Pizzagate.com or conspiracy.net. The Nuremberg Code emphasizes that people cannot be forced to take experimental drugs without their full consent. Now, interestingly here, the term Nuremberg Code originated in 1947 Germany during the Nuremberg trials, where, of course, Nazi doctors attempted to excuse the inhumane and deadly experiments that they conducted on concentration camp prisoners by claiming that there were no explicit rules governing medical research on human beings in Germany during that period. But you're probably thinking, well, hey, hold on, that's Nazi Germany. And Nuremberg Code or not, the U.S. government would never administer.
Yeah. So the implication is that having a requirement in order to work at certain places or go to certain schools or whatever the case may be, that's equivalent of a phase 3 trial, widely phase 3 trialed vaccine is similar to Nazi medical experimentation on Jews. Now, that sounds sort of crazy because it is. So then when he brings on his guest, Matt Staver, he sort of says, you know, we're not literally saying that, but you kind of are, dude. Take a listen.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You say the sirens should go off, and you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the sirens are going off the other way. The unvaccinated in this country are being demonized. There's discriminatory stuff going on out there. I'm curious as it relates to the legal issues here regarding the Nuremberg Code. I mean, if it's under experimental use, what does that mean legally in terms of...
Now, even that, when they say it just so happens that experiment and emergency both start with the letter E. An EUA is an emergency use authorization. It's not an experimental use authorization. That's another deliberate deception.
This going up the legal food chain, what could happen here?
Well, even before you get to the Nuremberg Code, you have the emergency use authorization law. And it clearly says that you have the, quote, option to accept or refuse, close quote. That's repeated in the fact sheet required by the FDA, and it's also mentioned many times by the FDA. So that's the end of story. You have the option to refuse when it's an EUA, and it's an EUA specifically designated so by the FDA.
Now, do you guys believe that when, you know, we're somewhere between 2 and 5 weeks from at least the Pfizer vaccine given permanent approval by the FDA? Do you think that when that happens, they'll just say, oh, now we're good, now go and get vaccinated? Of course not. They're just going to come up with something else.
And federal law. In the Nuremberg Code, the very first point says that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. There should be no duress, no deception, no pressure, and we're doing exactly the opposite. We are violating federal law. We're violating the Nuremberg Code. All of these will be brought into court to raise these issues because we are repeating, this is the tragic part of this, we're repeating the dark history of Nazi Germany, and we're not learning the lessons that the Nuremberg
You know, we're really not, Matt.
Code and those Nazi experiments should have taught this generation.
So you're likening it to that time period. We talked about that in the monologue, and we want to be clear. I guess we have to do the disclaimer about the Holocaust and Jews. We're not talking about that.
Right. I begrudgingly have to mention we're not really talking about the Holocaust, except we are, because we're saying that a required vaccine after phase 3 trials violates the Nuremberg codes, just like the Nazis did during their medical experiments. It's crazy. This is where they're now. This is the plane where they now exist. Here's one more example. Newsmax guest Pastor Brian Gibson, says that vaccination.
Congratulations, sir!
Whoa.
You just won the election.
That was actually an accident. Newsmax guest Pastor Brian Gibson says vaccination is going to provide a framework for future genocide. Yeah.
What do you make of that, Pastor?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're playing. This comes straight out of the Marxist handbook, right? You try to set as many different groups against each other as you can in a nation to weaken it, tear it apart, and rebuild it in the image you want. At first in America, it was racial tension, black versus white. Now we're moving from vaccinated to the unvaccinated. And I'll tell you, it's scary because whenever you see guys saying, you see leaders saying, you can go to the gym if you have the vaccination. You see the president talking about the problem that is the unvaccinated. These things have played out before in history.
He's sort of alluding to saying the unvaccinated in a pejorative way is like when the Nazis started saying the Jews. That if you're not making the connection, this is the analogy he's making. And then he actually just straight up says it.
Where you take a certain group of people and demonize them. Yeah. And I'll tell you what it is. It's a framework for animosity between two groups at best. At worst, it's a framework for a future genocide.
So there it is. Just like the Jews started to be demonized by the Nazis, the unvaccinated are starting to be demonized by the vaccinated, I guess, and by Joe Biden. That we are in real serious trouble here as a country, my friends, if these narratives become the prevailing narrative. So once we get that FDA approval, let's see how many of them go out and get vaccinated. It won't be, quote, experimental anymore, as they like to say. Let's see how many of them go out and get vaccinated at that point in time. Let me know your thoughts on Twitter. You can find me at dpacman. And remember that we are now just about 10 days away from the David Pakman Show 16th anniversary. On that day, August 16th, you can get an insanely discounted David Pakman Show membership. I would love for you to do that and support the program. If you want to be notified on August 16th of how to do that, just get on my newsletter at davidpakman.com. Science has shown us that lowering your body temperature at night helps you sleep. I can't sleep in a hot room. That's why I love our sponsor, Chili Sleep, which makes customizable climate-controlled sleep solutions to sleep better. Their flagship products are the Uller sleep system and the Cube sleep system, which is what I have. Both are hydro-powered, temperature-controlled luxury mattress pads. You can make them as cold as 55 degrees Fahrenheit. If you wanted, you could go as hot as 115 degrees. I like the cooler option. I keep mine at 60 degrees, and it gives me a great cool night of sleep. No feeling hot, no more sweating. I'm falling asleep faster, and it pairs perfectly with Chili Sleep's weighted Chili Blanket, which keeps you cold on top, too. They'll give you 20% off everything when you go to chilisleep.com/Pakman. The link is right underneath this video.